a city.
I suppose it just shows you how suddenly volatile the system can be with something like this, right? And suddenly then maybe a problem you didn't foresee suddenly becomes quite a huge crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. You've just got this choke point. You've got so much trade going through it at any one time. You've just come off COVID. There's a lot of markets restocking. What's interesting is if you look at the numbers, the COVID stimulus globally is worth something like 9% of global GDP. It's the largest stimulus by far. The GFC was somewhere around 3 or 4%. So this is an absolutely huge injection of cash and liquidity into the global economy. Everybody's trying to restock, and then you close down,
and then suddenly bottlenecks.
so,
not a good timing.
It's quite a staggering thing. And I think fortunately, the Egyptian government started early with accepting international help, which is not because they can or can't do it, but you guys, problem of the scale, it's just how fast you can do it. So it's been, so they say that the ship is starting to move a little bit. So.
Yeah, and in many people's interest to get it moved quickly.
Yeah. Free help. All right, let's kick off. Okay, so today we're going to be looking at an introduction to the analysis of foreign markets. So we start off with some general, a quick review of our previous lecture, as we usually do. And then we move on to some political economy questions and to multilateral views of foreign countries. So, we've got some interesting stuff, particularly in the politico-economic, but also in the emerging market analysis. So that should be quite good. We've got a couple of group things, and then obviously we're going to get onto the Intel case, which I think is quite sharply this question of internationalization and how governments need to compete. And these kind of factors we've been dragging forward, and perhaps the first two lectures may have felt quite academic. What is this trade theory? Why are we talking about that? One of the readings, Hausman's comments on the global economy. You actually say, where does this fit in? But this is, of course, fundamentally on international business, not primarily on pure company strategy. And so it's really valuable to have a look through that. Right, so just to recap, we spoke about the adding framework, and you note that this is going to be part of the next presentation. But it's really important that a company can answer this question, why are we internationalizing? And we said that there's adding volume, and you really need to ask the question, okay, great, more volume, where are we in the economies of scale? And what is the slope of our economies of scale? Are we going to be decreasing costs? In other words, what costs are spreadable? And if you recall, we spent quite some time in the previous lecture talking about this idea that there's a tension. How much do you need to localize versus how much can you leave globalized? And so costs decrease slower when you need to customize your product. But there's also opportunities for arbitrage. And we said critically something like textiles would be a key arbitrage. But we also see that in the Intel case. You would have noted, and you got A and B, that there's definitely arbitrage questions going on when multinationals internationalize. We then talk about differentiation. Do we improve the customer value? And how much adaptation is needed? And what is the advertising intensity needed? So I look at something like the Fay milk case. You're really internationalizing to gain access to a commodity, maybe a little bit of increased volume. If you recall, 15% of extra volume was going to Canada, but a lot of this was securing a resource. And then we look at something like Intel or the beer cases where you've got a lot of these different factors at play. Why are we adding volume? Why does AB InBev keep doing this? I mean, what's the point? Are there decreasing costs? How do they differentiate? We've also got this question about, do you improve your industry? Are there country differences in profitability? And are there differences in efficiency and practices that you can exploit one country to another? Normalizing risk, which is economic, how similar the economies in linkage and the overlap in products. So as we said, what you ideally want is no difference in the products, but very different economies. And in fact, we saw in the beer case that seasonality is a big thing. And so from a very simplistic level, there's no problem with having a northern hemisphere distribution and a southern hemisphere distribution. Makes your cash look a lot flatter. And then generating knowledge through localization pressures and the sophistication of supplier partner network. Maybe not so big in beer market, but quite big in Intel. One of the key things, that I noticed on the case that we did now with the beer is perhaps this idea of how intense is inter-firm rivalry. And we'll probably come back to that. But one of these key questions is, well, on what basis do firms compete? And I would suggest that when firms are competing in value added or in better logistics, this is kind of positive net welfare, positive competition, whereas when it's pure discounting, it's negative. And so certainly when you look at this adding framework, you say, why do firms internationalize? There's a lot of different reasons, and it's important to identify them, and we certainly need to in our case. And you've all now got the case for Peugeot. And so for motor industry, it's really important to understand, well, why are they going into different countries? Some of you have got United States, some of you have got India, but you've also seen the General Motors video, and there is a great example of, well, when are you improving your industry and strategic position? When are you generating knowledge, and when are you simply losing money? So these are key considerations. I also wanted to recap the entry mechanism, and we're going to do a breakout just in a slide or so. But we spoke very quickly about this. Remember the Uppsala proposition, this is several lectures ago, said that effectively you start with low complexity challenges, such as simply exporting your product. That can be with no warranty. Effectively, you're sending a box overseas. And once you get used to that, you then might set up a foreign sales office, maybe even a foreign subsidiary, and then you get all the way to setting up a company, which could include manufacturing or the kind of value creation. So when we look at entry mechanisms, firstly, we have a look at the scale, because that really talks about what we can do. And then we've got these types: greenfield, a JV or a partnership, the acquisition, and then licensing or distributor or selling. So I want to just look at those four and say that the key items you've got to consider are, how big are you? And I've put this in some order of importance. You may have, for those of you where this is the end of the course, seen some of Sal's work, where he really talks about agile, and the firms are either very agile or they're just able to absorb a lot of pain. And so very big firms are kind of can take on more risk, because when these things don't work out, it doesn't cause an existential crisis to them. How confident are you in the regulatory environment? This is another central question. How much is your investment? Very different thought process if it's a relatively small versus relatively large. How experienced are you in internationalizing? Of course, the more experienced you are, the more likely you are to make that successful. How much intangible asset is in your portfolio, and how sophisticated is the cluster, and how distant is the culture? So really, there we've got 7 questions, and we're gonna go over page and ask and put the 7 questions in different scenarios. And effectively, we want to have a group of decisions as to how we would enter a market based on these. You recall we saw some information that said the more distant the culture, the more likely you are to greenfield. The bigger you are, the less sensitive you are to the size of investment. The more experience you have, the more likely you are to greenfield. And the more intangible assets you have in your portfolio, the more likely you are to avoid a joint venture. And those things follow from kind of just a simple look at the problem. If I've got a huge amount of intangible asset, well, simply if I partner with someone, they may leave with my intangible assets. And how safe am I with that? So this is the slide we're going to break out to have a look at. I'm going to put you into 3 random groups. And for each of these columns, if you would just pick one of the 4 entry points and have a reasonable rationale for why would you choose that style of entering when this is the set of characteristics that your company has. I think some of this you'll be a little more familiar with because you've just done you prepped for the Intel case. Right. So now we've got quite a few scenarios, where we're looking at. What is the kind of optimal entry mechanism? And you would have had you've now seen the kind of key concerns, but I'm not going to ask you to tell me the decisions just yet. Which do you feel are the most problematic scenarios?
Maybe the one with the weak regulatory environment.
Yeah, absolutely. So weak regulatory environment requires a different approach, and we're going to talk about that soon. But if I said there's two scenarios here that I would feel would be very tough situations, which ones would they be?
Maybe around the inexperience of the company linked with the cultural distance being high.
Yeah, so there is some combinations, and I'm going to point out,
Okay.
and maybe we can discuss them. So I think scenario 4 looks like a difficult one for a couple of for a couple of reasons. So you've got a decent regulatory environment, okay, but you need a big investment. You are not experienced, and a lot of it's intangible. This is going to provide some challenges, right? A big investment for an inexperienced firm should always be a place you go, wow, where do we go to with this? I mean, on their upside, it is a big company in this nominal, so that's not so bad, and the cultural distance is low. So we have a sense that maybe they would understand the market, maybe they're not betting their life on it, but you are taking a big bet, and you're not experienced. So I'd suggest this is pretty unusual. It's something maybe a little bit, be a bit cautious about. And then we've got scenario 7, and maybe let me just highlight that. Over here. And here again, you're inexperienced. So this is a real issue, right? Once you're experienced, again, with a big investment, just as for 4. So a big investment where you're inexperienced, and now, as you pointed out, you're in a weak regulatory environment. So things just look worse and worse, right? You go, I'm not 100% sure. So I think in principle, as you add up negatives or things that make it more difficult, these overall become very difficult. So let's quickly go through ideas about number 1. What's the kind of thoughts of a good entry strategy in number 1?
We went with acquisition.
Any differences? Did all groups go with acquisition?
I take that as a yes.
I would say joint venture. The reason is that the cultural distance is very high, so it might be risky to go for M&A.
Okay. So, I mean, yep, there's, and Paul, do you want to make the case for acquisition?
Yeah, we just talked about the need to potentially learn from another company in that space. We've got low intangible assets, so we're kind of looking at how we can learn and learn from the knowledge of the other company. And I can't remember the experience, big, good size investment, and also the cultural distancing being high as well.
So, I mean, I think that they're both valid, and Jiang's right. In general, higher cultural distance makes these sorts of things harder. Because you have to do one of two things. We saw in CFAO and Toyota Tsusho that it's okay but then you have to leave the company well enough alone and let them operate as is. So that is an approach. And in a joint venture, you've got much higher levels of interaction required. And so that cultural distance will become increasingly challenging. All right, the next one, and we're only going to do, let's say, the first 4 of these. The next one, who's going to go for what they put out?
I mean, again, I'll jump in with our team. We went with joint venture on this one just because we was concerned about the regulatory environment being weak, and we felt that maybe we need to at least be aligned with people that understand the systems and politics.
Any other thoughts?
Our group think it's good because in Intel's case, actually they have the negotiation with the president of the Ho Chi Minh City's president, and they actually allow them to remove the wafer outside the factory, and also give them the land. So I think it's based on Intel case is good.
And so, are you supporting the joint venture idea here? I'm saying for this case here.
The Intel, right? We're talking about.
No, I was just saying for case number 2.
Case number 2.
No, not case number 2. I mean the scenario 2 here.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's no problem. Did your group have a different?
It's okay, Joyce. You can just agree with me.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, because I'm in the wrong situation.
No problem.
Yeah, Nicholas, our group, right? We actually analyzed this based on the Intel. We thought that we were supposed to look at the case study and analyze this. That's what Peggy was trying to say. But yeah, when we look at this, joint ventures seem to be able to apply in the second column.
Yeah, I agree. So look, one of the things, remember when you've got weak regulations, we're going to cover it in some detail in a few seconds, is that existing businesses have solved a lot of these market problems. And so, I mean, joint venturing or acquiring these businesses can help you understand and solve a lot of problems up front, which may not be apparent in your home market. So, yeah, I mean, I think that they certainly have high validity. Although, as you'd notice in Intel's case, Intel went, what is the absolute key difference between column 2 and Intel? So when I say column 2, I mean this column and Intel. What is the key difference? Well, there's 2, but I mean, what's the key one? Because you know what Intel's decision was. So what we're saying JV, did Intel not do an international business course, or what is the big difference? Well, the very big difference is here, right? So you joint venture and you are sharing your IP. So the chance that Intel is going to JV is quite slim, right? Just because what they're doing is, their premise of competition isn't efficiency. It's kind of this ability to, produce the most advanced things that they can. Now, I mean, this is not exclusive. Companies like SanDisk do joint venture, but, they kind of have one joint venture partner. But I think that that's quite a key difference. You saw Intel went it alone. They went into a market with high cultural distance, all the kind of rules we say, and they set up their own plant. All right, last one. How about we do scenario number 3? And as you can see, there's no right or wrong. So I'd like somebody, as well as Paul, to please comment. Do I need to call out people? I mean,
I'm just going to have a go, Nicholas, and I'm probably very wrong. but because I'm just still getting my head around it. So you're just looking at of that list where you've got greenfields, JV partnerships, acquisitions, right? So would this be greenfields?
Okay, so just give us the logic for it. I mean, as you can, it'll be whatever the company decides, but
yes,
if I gave you this country to enter, why would you do greenfields?
And like I said, I'm probably interpreting this graph very incorrectly, but everything's pretty positive except the intangible assets, I suppose. So it's a good concentrated market to enter into because the regulatory environment's favorable. You've got a big investment. Size of the company, although cultural distancing is high, so that's probably not so good. I don't know.
How I would look at scenario 3 is saying you've got a good environment, so your investment is going to be safe.
Yeah.
Right. So you can probably figure this out by yourself.
Yeah.
The company is big and the investment is big, but that's okay, right? So they can afford it.
Yeah.
And they're a little inexperienced. Cultural distance is high. This is Fay Milk. Greenfield is an acceptable sort of outcome to them. Not impossible at all.
Could
you buy something? Absolutely. Yeah.
Would acquisition be a fit? Because I'm inexperienced.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah, and I have low intangible asset and my cultural distance is high. So I'll go for acquisition. Absolutely.
So TTC and CFO, acquire it. So it's not so much just worrying about, there's no right or wrong. This is how, this is not, as you've seen, and Jenny, you're right, CFO, or TTC bought CFO where the cultural distance could hardly be further. But they were big, reasonably inexperienced in Africa, certainly. And on the other hand, we had Fay Milk doing its own greenfield with effectively these things. Maybe intangible assets was middle or high. And I think that this points out one of the features is that this analysis needs to be done by company. But the important thing is that you have a sense of what are these dimensions. That you say, if my cultural distance is far, then when I integrate a joint venture, I'm going to work a lot. Whereas if I set up a greenfield, I can largely transplant my head office culture. When the regulatory environment is poor, I need to be very sensitive to how do I manage a lot of market problems. Now, if you're Intel, as we see, you may say, it doesn't really matter. I'm so big and so powerful that I can make this work. But if you're not that scale, that becomes a really important consideration. When your investment is big versus your company or capital base, this leads you to go, should I not rather partner with someone who can share the risk? Because if it doesn't work out, maybe I'm in a lot of trouble. So I think the key point here is not that there is a directive, here's a list and it's a matrix and every time we should do this. It's very important that you look at these questions and simply think about them saying, I'm happy that this is my course of action and I've noted the following problems. Because if you're ever asked to internationalize something, every internationalizing experience is going to be a balance of problems that you've got to solve and opportunities that you can get to. And the big thing in business is that's always the way. If you can identify the problems you're going to have, you're winning. It's not that you'll never have problems, no matter what you do. It's not possible. All right, excellent. So now we go on to emerging markets.
Sorry, yeah. I just asked this because out of interest, would it, on the last one, just because we didn't talk much about license and distributor, yeah. Would that be somewhere maybe like, I was trying to think maybe case 8, is it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, case 7, where there's a kind of a more weakness in experience, low, is that where you would maybe? You would
classically, I would suggest intangible assets aren't great to license out because people can keep them.
Yeah.
But in a good regulatory environment, which is case 8, I think, that's not so bad.
Yeah, okay.
When you have low intangible assets, absolutely. I think that licensing, works where you've got low intangible assets, right? where you've got weak regulatory environment. So you may even argue that licensing is, over here, licensing is not inappropriate here. You're pretty inexperienced. You don't have a lot of intangible assets, and it would be a big investment. Why not license?
Okay.
No problem with licensing there. So I would suggest that licensing is more attractive when you have less intangible assets and when you're more inexperienced.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
So if you're very experienced, well, you might be able to own the whole value chain. So
yeah, Cindy, Cindy selected license and distribution for KC. You should have jumped in, Cindy. You had that one nailed.
yeah, so I mean that's what, and you can see even amongst here, you can see why this can become a detailed board discussion, because it's not, there's not an answer. There is, what problem are we best able to solve? These are the kind of broad tools you can use. Okay, so business groups are simply groups of businesses that are tied together through equity and boards. Pretty straightforward, but they are much more common in emerging markets than in advanced markets. And the question really is why? So business groups are much more common in emerging markets. I'm going to go through this and then we're going to break into another group, because I'm going to ask you the question, why would a business group perform better? And again, it's just going to be 5 minutes, but I'm going to ask one representative to kind of give 3 reasons why a business group will perform better in a developing market. And to kick this off, I'm just pointing out the difference between developed and developing markets. So from a capital markets perspective, you've got developed markets are equity focused and you monitor them via disclosure rules. So if you're in Australia or Singapore or the United States, you can read annual financial reports and you have a reasonable sense of where the company is. The labor market tends to be pretty good. You've got a lot of business schools. The product market tends to be regulated. You have a lot of liability laws, warranty laws. Key, the information flow is good. The consumers are quite active. Government regulation is high, and that's low corruption, so negative corruption. And you've got pretty predictable contract enforcement. In developing economies, your capital markets tend to be more bank focused. So not so much equity market focused. Your labor market has fewer schools and shallower supply pools. And although you've got warranty and liability laws, they are maybe patchily enforced. The information flow is moderate. You still have pretty active consumers, and now you have this kind of mixed picture in terms of corruption. And finally, in frontier markets, so frontier markets would be really emerging markets. This is the JP Morgan definition. Capital markets are quite illiquid, and you actually monitor things through bureaucracy. So are you frankly violating the law? You have few schools, very localized skills. So think something like Ethiopia, Eritrea. Regulation is poor, information flow is poor, lots of corruption. And you have very unpredictable contract enforcement. So again, what we're going to do now is we're just going to pause and say, why do business groups perform better over here versus over here? You can have any theory you want, group of theories, but the key thing is we're talking about why do they perform better? Is it cultural? Is it economic? What do they do that makes them perform better? Cool, everybody's going to be out in like another 10 seconds.
No worries.
Okay. Do we have some answers? Tell us about proportion of jobs, GDP, tax revenue.
Our team basically did a bit of guessing and was like, it's got to be quite high. given the development that's happened in China.
Given the rest of the lecture, yeah, I'm not sure.
Given it, given the input from your lecture, Nicholas. But then we did a little bit of searching around, and we reckon that it accounts for around 60% of the GDP from private companies, and a huge proportion of 80% around jobs. And we were kind of debating on this one and why this happened, but obviously looked at like global pressure, international pressure in terms of kind of global competition was probably something that was a lever, and then the need to then kind of compete with the big markets. I suppose the US would be one of their biggest people that they're chasing. Yeah.
Any other groups want to provide some contributions?
Actually, when I trigger and search, surprisingly, it's shocking. In highest GDP now is US, and next one is China. It's kind of alarming to see a 19 trillion GDP in China. United States is 19 trillion. China is 12 trillion. That's a big one, you know.
Yeah, it's huge.
Yeah.
And any idea on ideas like when did the GDP in China begin its climb? What was the trigger?
The 1990s.
80s?
Yeah, no.
90s, 80s, 90s.
All right, so we've got some, and anybody else want to contribute? Group? No? Silence. Okay, tough crowd. Okay, so you're right. So 80% of new jobs are created by private market enterprise in China, something like 2/3 of GDP, and incredibly something like 90% of all their taxation revenue. So I mean, I think it's quite clear to say that the free market has served China well. When it says when did the start happen, that probably happened around the 70s when Chairman Mao passed away, and the leadership of China went to who was a gentleman who was then his 2IC, who has a very colorful history, Deng Xiaoping. That's the one. And what he did was his first reform was a seemingly quite small reform on agriculture, and the agricultural reform was, and I'm simplifying a lot, but this idea that once you produced your quota of rice, anything else you produced, you could sell at whatever price you wanted. And agricultural productivity doubled. So the same land, same people, same skills, same everything else, and you have 2 times output. And that's fundamentally the start of this incredible journey. And it talks to the same thing we've been talking to through these past few slides, which is, provided reasonable incentives and opportunity, you can take people and they will largely solve their own problems for you. I'm going to say for you, for themselves, which is very useful. And then the last question, when was the Chinese economy this big in global terms? And does anybody have any thoughts on that?
After WTO?
Sorry?
After the WTO?
I didn't catch you on the second time.
Oh, after they joined the WTO.
Yeah, so, well, I think the Chinese economy has been growing since then, but my question is more on a very long-term historical perspective. And I would suggest that the last time the Chinese economy was this big in global terms is probably around the 1600s. And so, you can look that up, the share of global GDP. But the key thing that was going on was that the Chinese economy at this stage had stopped trade, and if you recall that the Portuguese were ceded Macau somewhere around the late 1500s, early 1600s, and the English, had the Hong Kong territory ceded to them probably much later. I think it was in the 1700s, and so you went from China in the 1400s, where it was, technologically and economically absolutely enormous, for about 500 years of isolation, self-imposed isolation, where it became very small and then went through some disastrous events under the communist trial. And then from Deng Xiaoping's reforms, has grown to the world's second largest economy. And I think all expectations are this is going to be the world's largest economy at some stage. Now, will it keep accelerating or keep going at this pace of growth? I think that broadly it's agreed no, but there is 1 billion people. So although the GDP per capita isn't expected to catch up, it does have 4 times the population of the United States. This is likely to be the world's largest economy. Right, so the required quad is property rights, incentives, individualism, and competition and trade. I'm sorry, that says triad. And as soon as you provide these 4 things, you develop an economy. So we started with this idea that Deng Xiaoping allowed property rights and incentives. You could keep the rice you grew over the quota, and you could sell it for whatever price you want. So property, it's yours. Incentives, you can sell it as much as you want. And then you've seen this kind of progression towards much more individualism. So you can buy goods that you want. It's no longer central planning. You want to buy a Chanel handbag, go buy it. Or a car, you want to buy a Geely or a VW, please make your choice. And competition and trade. So I would suggest that these 4 things have been the foundation of that prosperity. And so the real question is long-term, and the suggestion is at the moment democratic systems outperform in the long run because they limit the ability of people in power to expropriate assets. So this is kind of the soft benefit of democracy. It's a much more messy process. It's much slower, but in the long run, it's very difficult to have a series of good lifetime presidents. Very, very few countries have got this right, and perhaps Singapore is a standout example of when it goes well. But for every one of those examples, there's 20 African countries which can demonstrate how badly it can go. The critical challenges today are things like populism and divisiveness, and they are topics in of their own right. Autocracies typically fail when they control the market because they can't innovate and they cannot replicate the efficiency. So at some level of complexity, central planning stops working, which we've discussed now at length. But at a macro level, autocracies struggle to limit themselves from fiddling with the market. And this is probably the single biggest risk that the Chinese economy faces, is that the government tries to fiddle too much in its economy. And it's dabbled a few times in this, particularly amongst the funding. So state-owned enterprises received a very abnormal share of all funding for a while, and that's been backed off. So, okay, so now we just move through some sort of just content, property rights. This is simply the legal right over a resource. And obviously private action, theft, piracy, blackmail, we all understand this, but public action like extorting income or resources, and this occurs in several ways: excessive taxation, licenses, permits, and nationalization. So property rights are violated by all of these, and as I pointed out, the intervention in the Ant Group's listing was a very unusual and not good move. There's a global measure of this, corruption by country, and you've got countries with very low perceived levels and countries with very high perceived levels of corruption. There is an important act. If you only know one act from the book, it's this one, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And what that is any company that wants to do business in the United States cannot do any of this. So it's illegal to bribe a foreign official. You must keep detailed public records so it's clear if a violation occurred, and you cannot have facilitating or expediting payments to secure, to get an abnormal contract. but if it does allow routine government action, then it is permitted. The reason this is so important is if you're excluded from the US economy and you're a multinational, that's a very big deal. And so this kind of pushes these dubious practices one level away, and any pressure on corruption is good. So protection of intellectual property, obviously, this is much less in developing economies, but it has the same productive consequences. And intellectual property rights are things like patents, copyrights, trademarks, but they're just as important. Economic transformation. So obviously, this is something that occurred particularly in the 70s in the Western economies. Deregulation, privatization, and the creation of a legal system to safeguard property rights. The central problems, as we've discussed, are externalities and inequality. And we're not going to spend time because I want to, create enough time for us to discuss our case study. But externalities are things like environmental problems. When you allow firms to produce their goods, they respond to what the market wants, and consumers effectively want the cheapest goods that are possible, but when they vote, they want more environmental protection. And so government sort of transmits that pressure back in the form of regulation. And inequality. Inequality is much, much bigger, though, between countries than it is inside a country. So if you go back to 1850, the richest country in the world was around the median person in the richest country in the world was around 16 times more wealthy than the poorest country in the world. And I think this was something like the difference was Sweden versus Madagascar. Today, the median person in the richest country from the richest country in the world in GDP per capita terms is around 256 times as wealthy as the median income from the poorest 10% of countries. So I would suggest that whilst the inequality argument is valid, you need to put it in context and say that the system has delivered unbelievable economic growth and standards of living improvements, although it does look like inside those economies you've got more inequality. But when you compare it with the other systems, they just leave people in grinding poverty. And so I'd suggest that one needs context when looking at that problem. Part of that transformation was deregulation, removing price controls, abolishing limits, laws limiting private enterprise, and removing restrictions on foreign investment and trade. So, it may surprise you, but the United States around in the 1970s was actually extensively regulated, much more so than today. And regulation really becomes quite bizarre. So in its attempt to manage competition in the airline industry, things like the size of sandwiches was eventually regulated. Because once airlines ticket pricing was the same, then they competed with bigger seats. So they regulated seat size. And then they said, well, I'll produce better food. So then they regulated food. So it becomes quite insane what happens. And deregulation actually, was a big process in getting rid of these crazy regulations. And then finally, privatization. So privatization moved a lot of these inefficient assets out of the state into private investors. And we have seen both good and bad consequences of this. Obviously, good consequences was, massively improved productivity. And in some cases, you had poorly regulated final market solutions where natural monopolies kind of started to exist. And I'd suggest that if you're looking for an example of where this sort of thing can go wrong, look at Enron, because it's a funny movie to watch, but it also shows what happens when you poorly regulate a market where you can create a natural monopoly. So it's not at all a criticism of privatization, more of awareness of the final market you can create. All right, so now we're going to move on. That's our political economy. And if we've got some questions, now is a good time. We have gone through that quickly. As you can imagine, it's an absolutely enormous topic and we could spend a lot of time talking about it. But perhaps in a more Your book has several chapters devoted to this, but we're really focused on the business aspect, and that's why we're kind of parking it in half a lecture. So are there any debate points, comments, observations? Should we move on?
The other thing I was going to mention, Nicholas, was I suppose I keep coming back to that this context of like in my context in the UK, like privatization of the public transport has been a real contentious thing, and there's kind of an issue where people find that the mostly, and I'm from the north of England, which I think again is a different, regional context is important, but it's quite inefficient as a privatized system, and it's not quite delivering what it should in terms of social mobility, economic, driving economic growth. So I suppose in some places you see privatization working and others it doesn't. And it just seems to be obviously so many complex factors contributing to that.
Yeah, so I mean, the English rail system's got some fascinating problems. So one of the rules, as you're probably aware, is some of the routes need to have a train running. And so there'll be no passengers on the train. They're kind of called ghost trains, and there's a whole Instagram group which simply travels on these trains where there's nobody else traveling. Now, the private market would stop that train service immediately, right? If you were running that business, you would close that route. So the question really becomes, well, if we privatize a market, how many funny rules should we leave in place? And I'll give you another great example of this kind of problem. So in South Africa, around the technological revolution of mobile phones, they were also going through a political change, and they made the state-owned telephony service provide copper fixed line services to every single person in the country, right? So this is not a bad goal. I mean, I suppose, who knows? And what that meant was that you couldn't profitably do this to rural areas because you just don't have the population density. But because that was the government's instruction, they built all this copper line, and then they had to charge everybody in metros twice as much, right? Because somebody's got to pay for this mess. And so what happened is everybody in metros desubscribed and went onto their mobile phones. And so it really brings up the core problem, which is not so much does privatization seek out efficiency, and I would argue that it does, and Greg and I have had debates around how exactly does that happen. But the point is that between government and society, you establish a framework, and the system generates the best efficiency you can within that rule set. So as a transport problem, it's probably more efficient in the north of England to give everybody Uber vouchers than to try and make the trains run all over the show. And that maybe not be something people want to hear, but I would suggest that might be a cheaper solution. And what gets in the way of that? Well, lots, as you said, there's a lot of things that get in the way. The people who run the ticket stations, people who maintain railway tracks. There's a whole heap of interest groups.
Massive infrastructure issues. I say like that more, seems to come up a lot. And my father works on the metro links on that line, and she's managed by a European company, and massive infrastructure issues and investment issues actually. But then you see in Singapore, like I'm amazed, like the system works so well here, right? It's efficient. It's pretty much always running. It's on time. It's so well controlled.
I think that some of the challenges they're solving are different as well. If you have very high population density, it's very difficult to compare the New York metro system or the London Underground or the Singapore system to trying to do rail throughout a country.
Greater Manchester network. That's very.
I go like so. I mean, the market economy delivers greater efficiency, and I suppose it's important to go, when we deliver this efficiency, what are the social costs that we're not willing to accept, and how do we most cheaply pay for it, or should we keep stuff public? And Europe, just to finish the rail conversation, Europe sees the same problem. Rail traffic keeps declining. Rail interest groups keep wanting investment. And so, as an example, in England, you've got HSE, high-speed link, which is trying to do some sort of several hundred kilometers of link. No problem with that. In France, they want to extend high-speed network, And in China, they've built thousands and thousands and thousands of kilometers of ultra high speed network. So this comes down to spending priorities by government as much as it does anything else, because it's sort of, it doesn't seem to make sense that it's a technology that works wonderfully in one area and terribly in another.
Yeah, totally. Go. Thank you, Nicholas.
All right, industry and institutions. So we're going to take a break after these slides. This is about multilateral country analysis, and we're going to move on to Intel. As we noted in the second lecture, somebody called Lidner noted that countries trade with other countries which have similar GDP, and therefore you don't always see capital-rich countries exporting capital-rich products. And so markets are more similar than that trade together. Markets can be more similar than we initially thought. Institutions might be more similar, and consumers might be more similar, even advertising. And there are some multilateral measures. And what a multilateral measure is something that you can look up on the internet, and it just takes a country versus every other country in the world. Now, these have some limits, and we're going to touch on that in just a few slides' time. But as an example, the World Economic Forum, or the WEF, notes that for income growth, there are fundamental requirements. And their first model looked actually like this. So they started with a model that said, if you want to be a factor-driven economy, in other words, sort of a resource extractor, you needed to get right institutions, infrastructure, macroeconomy, and health and primary education. And then if you wanted to be the next stage of economy, you needed higher education, market efficiency, and technological readiness. And finally, if you were an advanced economy, you needed to be innovation. You needed all of the above, plus business sophistication and innovation. And I mean, this makes some intuitive sense, right? The problem, and we sort of pointed this out when we spoke briefly about Dani Roderick's criticisms of trade, is that even if you're in an economy which is just joining and you are far behind in terms of the sophistication curve, it is probably very difficult for you to now jump into mass manufacturing, because you need to compete with China. We see some of the criticisms, the new trade theory of Krugman going, well, if already textiles is saturated, simply because you come online probably doesn't mean you can attract them. It also means that industrialization is difficult. So we spoke about this term called premature deindustrialization. The point is that this model was around 20 years ago, and the model has expanded. There are a couple more levers than this, but it is to say that these are kind of great headings. And today, if you look at 2020, the World Economic Forum, fortunately or unfortunately, statistically, there is actually no difference in these three groups. In other words, if you want to compete, you've got to be working on all of these things. So that's in some ways bad news if you're an emerging economy, because what was kind of this nice idea that you had these basic requirements, perhaps you have to build them in this order, but unfortunately to compete, more and more, all of the factors are part of your mix, even if you're in an early stage. These multilateral measures, particularly of the World Economic Forum, are well correlated with your growth rate. In other words, these are not purely theoretical. And it is a part of a key measure is that the depth of the industry being targeted. So industry sophistication, as we've discussed, is not random, it is path dependent. In other words, your first, and we see this with Intel, and we're going to discuss why do countries offer incentives for companies like Intel. And the point to make is path dependent. You may recall we had a conversation about Kenya in one of our first classes. Why wouldn't Apple establish in Kenya? And they said, well, there's nothing there. So the reality is you need industry in order to walk up the scale of sophistication. And we said, actually, the words we used, you can't jump too high. Industries are heavily networked. And a key question to ask is whether the destination country is similar in industry sophistication to your origin country. That is a bilateral difference question, and we're going to talk about that in our next lecture. Why are industries so clustered? We actually touched on this. There's three forms of knowledge. You have tools, you have blueprints and processes, which are migratable, and you have know-how. And if you remember, we said that tools were the fastest to move. You can move equipment, machinery, that's shipping, Suez Canal, aside, you can get it anywhere you want pretty fast. Processes and IP you can train, but this know-how, this kind of intangible knowledge of how the process needs to work is actually quite slow to move. And I think in one of the comments, maybe even be yours, Paul, it is interesting to note how in Houseman's video, he notes that diaspora tend to transmit know-how. So it's much more complex and sophisticated than a manual. And so modern industry requires multiple outputs that are clustered. That was part of that video that some of you watched, or maybe many of you watched, and no industry is an island. And just to look at that, what does that look like visually? If you say, well, this is all really interesting, but perhaps quite theoretical, they've actually mapped, several people have mapped, I've left out some of those slides, but here's a map of what the global economy looks like. And what this is where things are next to each other, it means that when you learn one, it's easy to branch into another. When things are far apart, it means knowledge here adds very little to knowledge there. In other words, people who are good at one aren't good at the other. And that you would imagine is because it's difficult to be good at both, because there's not a lot of overlap. And so as you can see, things like oil industry tends to be quite standalone. Garments tend to form a cluster of things. In the middle here, you've got this big section around, this is a textile cluster, metallurgy. Got a lot of very dense connections in the middle that goes between electronics, vehicles and machinery. So you can see this kind of very dense clustering. And so what this tells you is if you get good at this, it's actually not a big leap to move into the next market. Whereas you've got these kind of sideline industries, which tell you, even if I'm good at oil, it doesn't mean I can do particularly well at forestry and paper products. And I think the idea behind that's pretty intuitive, although this is what it actually looks like. And so when we look at different countries, we actually have different looking maps. And so black tells you what that sector is good at. And so as you can see, advanced economies tend to be very heavily clustered around this. There's a lot of equipment and machinery manufacturing. You can see this dominance of computers and electronic equipment in East Asia, the Pacific, as well as a lot of textiles reflecting different economies and their skills. You also see some of the challenges sub-Saharan Africa faces. So really a lot of skills are outside of this core. And so if you're good at this, it's a long way to find another industry that you can be good at. And this is a fundamental challenge. And Latin America and the Caribbean have similar challenges, except I'd suggest that maybe there's a little more centralization, and that's probably in bigger economies like Brazil, where you found enough concentration to do these services, and Mexico as well. So you've got garments. So this is just a way of looking at the world. But again, it's important to kind of get a concept that industries do grow in a specific way, and some sensitivity to that's useful. The criticism of multilateral measures, they're valid, but they can be too general to use. Companies have unique resources. The resources we saw in resource-based theory are not global and generic, so your ability to generate value is quite context-specific. And so we need a new paradigm, which is bilateral assessment, which we'll pick up on in the next lecture. All right, I think that what would be ideal is, should we do a break before we start Intel? We're then going to break into some groups with questions. Peggy is saying absolutely, break and coffee is important.
Agree.
So we'll break then for 10 minutes now. We're going to get back, introduce some questions about Intel. So just on the Intel, I know you've got case B, and sort of it's an experiment. I wanted to see if giving you case A and case B, I hope it didn't spoil the surprise or the learning by having case B, which is kind of an answer. But I'll do my best to ask you questions that aren't fully answered by having case B. So I'll see you all in 10 minutes. Thank you. Okay, coffee's in place. Right, now we are talking about the Intel case study. As I said, there are two parts of the Intel case study, A and B. And whilst they're usually distributed, A and then B, because we're not in a live class environment, it makes it, a fair amount more difficult to do it in that order. Nonetheless, B provides you with, if you want, the answer, and in some ways makes it more difficult for you to think more clearly about what are the considerations, because kind of knowing the answer can sometimes overwhelm the thought process of going, well, why would they choose that? So hopefully we've got some questions, or I believe we do, that would be fairly challenging. All right, so, fundamentally, what's Intel doing? They're putting an assembly and testing plant. It's about a $300 million investment. Compared with a fabrication plant, this is not too big, fabrication being $2 billion. But anyway, it's still a substantial investment. This is a case from 2006, and they have several competitive locations. There's 4 locations listed in the case. So we've got, Thailand, Vietnam, China, and I don't offhand recall the 4th. Then, so what we want to do is create criteria, because I'm saying you've now got a case. You've got the answers to a case, which give you, some good insights. But I'd like to see some criteria that you would use and categorized, if you will, in terms of how do you choose if you're an Intel or Cindy is at another, semiconductor fab business, and what are the sort of criteria that you use. Number 2 is that criteria need to be ranked. It's not okay to have 10 criteria which are all of the same importance. Number 3 is list some agglomeration benefits and costs. We'll just expand on the term in a second. Number 4 is what are the determinants of government incentives? Which sort of governments will offer more versus who will offer less? What do governments want in return? And which incentives are easiest to get from governments? And then rank the relative sites. Now, I don't mind if you put what Intel chose as the top site, that's okay. So we're interested in what you put as 2, 3, and 4. So part of this question around agglomeration is the question of value creation versus value capture. So industry nodes make it easier to set up a functioning business. We've mentioned this before, and that's at least one big benefit. But the more established the node, the higher the competition, and that's the kind of cost. And I think we mentioned that before. So we really want to answer, it's key for us to answer, is there a difference between the largest firms and the smallest in terms of benefits? Who benefits more? So that's your agglomeration question, just expanded, it's not a new question. And then on government incentives, I'd like you to consider in your answer, what is important? Is immediacy important? How much front loading is important? How do you determine if front loading is important? Now, what does public opinion of the incentive need to be? What is the bargaining power of a firm? The marginal benefit.
Do you need to share PowerPoint or there's no PowerPoint?
I do need to share a PowerPoint.
Okay.
My apologies. Sorry. I'll put up the questions obviously when you go out. All right, so let me just go back one. Okay, value creation versus value capture. So industry nodes make it easier to set up a functioning business. That's the agglomeration benefit. But the more established, the more competition, that's the agglomeration cost. So is there a difference between what the largest and smallest firms will experience? Who will benefit more? And under government incentives, there are key questions. immediacy? Do incentives need to be front-loaded? I'd like you just to say, we want this upfront or not, and have a reason. And what does the public opinion of the incentive need to be? Does it matter as well? So when you say this is the government incentive that is important, you need to think of it in terms of these dimensions. Do I need it upfront? What is the public going to think of it? And then what is my bargaining power? What is my benefit to the country? And what is the stability of the negotiated outcome? So let's just go back. These are the questions, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What are the criteria you would use in order to assess plants? Rank the importance of those criteria. List some agglomeration benefits and costs, maybe 3 and 3. And talk about government incentives. What determines them? When do you get more versus less? What do they need in return? And finally, rank the relative sites. So I understand that Intel chose Vietnam. The question is, how would you rank the next ones? And that really depends on the criteria you're going to use, the importance of them, and your decisions around these two. Right, so we're going to do that over, I think, 12 minutes. Let's go to breakout rooms. And then I need someone just to present the group's perspective.
Nicholas,
Oh,
your
man.
clock is faster than anybody's clock, you know, Nicholas. I have to say that. You can't think faster than your clock, no matter how much you try, right? How
Okay, cool. So what we're going to do is each group just gets to talk about what the grouping is, how important the criteria, importance, how they see the different countries, and then agglomeration benefits and costs, and the determinants of the government incentives.
Okay, Vicky, can we go first? Can we go with the first one first? I think we don't have everything, Nicholas, but we'll try to answer whatever we have, okay?
Just give me one second so I can capture it for everyone.
Vicky, we go first, okay?
Yes.
Thank you, dear. Wow.
Next, I need to use the share function.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
you can use the share function, no problem.
I don't know what I wrote already. I have to see what I wrote. I don't know what I wrote already.
You know.
I don't know. So fast. Okay,
Yes,
so we our team kind of ranked the criteria, and I tried to rank them in terms of 10, since you need 10. One is cost. I think cost is important because it has to be a low cost operation, right? Such as low.
And when you say cost, just let's talk about, obviously cost has got labor, they talk about electricity, etc.
Labor cost.
Got it?
And then I'll look at location so that it is able to expand and gain their partners. Location is important. Location of where you set up, okay? Then government.
Okay, cool. I think location is probably too big a word. Do you want to give me some criteria about location? I mean, this kind of fundamentally is a location question. So
Okay,
do you mean physical? Do you mean it needs a lot of the property needs to be big, or proximity to suppliers, or what?
proximity to supplier. That means proximity to the partners, okay? Okay, and then government regulation, for example, in terms of what kind of tax, what kind of governmental controls, rules to trade for international. Okay.
All right.
Then supply of resource is the employee in terms of is it easy to hire people and things like that. Okay. Infrastructure will be infrastructure is in terms of the overall infrastructure in terms of the maturity of the infrastructure to set up.
Okay, so you mean probably power, like basic infrastructure, hard infrastructure, power, roads, etc. Okay.
Yeah. And then competition, are there a lot of competition there already? That's my consideration. And then, of course, how qualified are the laborers, right? Are they skilled? Are they educated? things like that. Then I think towards a bit challenging on the last few is political stability, whether there's a lot of corruption, whether there's a lot of IP rights. I think I'm looking at that perspective of political stability. Then 9 is the government condition security. It is secure, you know. When I thought about secure, I thought security condition of the country itself. Okay, then the last is natural disaster.
Yep, cool. That's pretty easy. Yep.
Okay, Hart, Vicky, your turn.
Is that the order of importance to you?
Yeah. Given that I only had 10 minutes less than that, yes.
Okay. No problem.
Okay, so some of the benefits and costs were low prices, but with greater choices, and economic of skills were lower prices, free movement of labor, global inequality. Then the cost will be environmental, structural unemployment, less cultural diversity, some of the most important one.
Okay, so maybe the question, I meant here is agglomeration means there's a lot of companies.
Residing.
Sorry? Well, what I'm saying is you've got a group of companies in a specific location. What's good about having a lot of your competitors in a location, and what's bad about having your competitors in your location?
Oh.
So agglomeration is
okay,
so everyone's in an area, right? I mean, in the case they talk about, they go Thailand as an example. In Bangkok, there's a lot of suppliers. So when we look at your group's criteria, you kind of go proximity to suppliers. Thailand is much stronger, right? You've got AMD is in Thailand, in Bangkok. So there must be some negatives to this. And what are they? So you just off the cuff, you can, it doesn't matter if this is what's on the slide.
I think the one of the benefit is that like the sharing the infrastructure cost. So for example, some water and then a power plant and etc.
Right.
And then the cost, right? Cost in terms of what?
What's bad about it? So here's a suggestion. So
the bad thing is the competition for hiring local talent.
Absolutely. So that is definitely a cost. So as soon as you you go to Silicon Valley today and you want to hire a person, you're going to pay probably 50% more than if you go to Los Angeles.
Right.
I mean, that's an agglomeration cost, right? It's it's not that they're necessarily more intelligent, it's just that that's in that area, that's how much they're going to cost you. Agreed. Any other sort of costs or benefits?
I think if you, for example, like a Intel, if you have other high and quality brand, so your reputation is also good as well.
So you're saying that's a benefit?
Yeah, benefits. We will stop here, leave to other groups. Right, just trying here for the last question.
Perfect.
So from the case study B, I found something like this: the determinants that government in the government incentive, like favorable grants along long-term road rates of power and water, and making the site attractive, including separate grant assigned to joint bank account, and workforce improvement, like Intel invests a lot of education, like school, into the local talents, and also included the ongoing maintenance expenses. And also these accounts also cover solar panels for the plant's roof. Is also very important for Intel operations. Founded.
So the question is, why does the government offer these incentives? And why? One of the key things that's noted in case B is that Thailand didn't offer the same incentives as Vietnam. Why not? I mean, all these benefits are true, right? Are they true for both countries?
these benefits are true, but these are all invested, like the money, the donation or the funding is all from Intel. So that's why.
So are you suggesting that Intel wouldn't have invested in Thailand? I mean, I think they would have, right?
Actually, from the case study itself, Intel does prepare to invest into the markets. However, there are also a lot of like ad hoc or unpredictable disaster, but they figure it out one by one.
But I open this to all the groups. The grants offered by Thailand are specifically noted as being less than Vietnam, right? Why?
I think this is just like from my understanding, from one of like the research for other assignment, the Vietnam government really like they encourage like the foreign direct investment for economic growth, and also like the Vietnam market is quite favored by Western MNC in terms of like quality of the talent and even like the cheap labor cost. So all the like the combination are really like the favored for economic growth in Vietnam. So that's why I think that Vietnam offered that kind of a grant.
But let's say you're running Thailand. And again, like this is to all groups. You're now running Thailand. And Intel says, I'll put up a plant. What incentives will you give me? And the case says that Thailand specifically offered lower incentives than Vietnam. Do you think that Thailand didn't think Vietnam would offer good incentives? So they misestimated their competitor? Did they not value Intel setting up a plant? Because the answers you're giving me are general. So, you know, Intel is going to invest, sure. But why did Thailand not try harder? And maybe China didn't and maybe India didn't, but I'm just saying specifically in the case it mentions Thailand. So, you know, I'm just using that. So I agree with you. Thailand's got a natural disaster risk as well. But parking that aside, we're not talking about what was Intel's final decision. We're saying what was the behavior of the government of Thailand?
Would they potentially have a, I'm just looking like at their investment in other, I think AMD was there, right, in Bangkok. So
that's right.
Could it be about protecting, did they want to put Intel off? I don't know, like about protecting other interests from other protection of other interests that they might have with other firms.
Well, I mean, maybe, but I mean, I would tend to agree with Jung. I think that everybody wants, and Vicky, everybody wants Intel there. So putting them off, I think it's less likely, but I mean, it's certainly a possibility.
I think maybe there is a conflict of the interest. So for example, for example, like the, I mean, a Vietnam government allowed MNC, foreign MNC, to purchase the land and etc. But in Thailand, the king does not allow the MNC to do so. Okay. So maybe, I mean, for semiconductor manufacturing plant, the company needs to have a land.
Yep.
And
I suppose I go maybe. Leon, let's hear it.
Yeah, Thailand is already a developed country. So Vietnam, they do not have a very good supply chain at this moment. So they hope that Intel comes in and try to build this supply chain for them. So there'll be more jobs created.
Yeah, and I think, Leon, that's probably sort of the fundamental answer here. I go, in the end, Vietnam is spending more than Thailand, right? This is their cost. However you break it up, they're spending more. And they must therefore think that they're getting a bigger benefit. And so their marginal benefit from Intel coming in and setting up all of this is worth them paying huge amounts for this factory. And as Leon said, Thailand might be simply saying our marginal benefit from another plant is much smaller. So we offer much less. What's the price? And whether that's right or wrong, I'm not, I don't know if I agree with Thailand, but I think fundamentally that's a key question in their mind. Who gets the biggest marginal benefit? And the government that gets the biggest benefit will probably pay the most.
Nicholas, I just want to share. Could it be the kind of investment that the government is interested in? For example, for Singapore, they used to encourage a lot of semiconductor investor. Then in the 80s, 90s, up to 2000, then they have a change of heart. They decided to go on biotechnologies, and they start to have more incentive given to such industries. So that could be one of the reasons why Thailand wasn't offering such good incentive to Intel, because this is not the industry that they want to develop in their country.
Okay, so I mean, let's unpack that. Let's say you're running Singapore, and now, do you think it's an arbitrary decision? Singapore simply said, look, we don't care about semiconductors, let's try something new. I mean, I don't look at that government as being particularly arbitrary. So perhaps here's some of the things that may have been going on. They go, we can no longer compete in this industry. So if our labor cost is really high, the incentive needs to be really, really, really high, because otherwise somebody says, well, I mean, I just can't produce it. Remember, on the other end is a Cindy or a Leon or a Jiung or a Paul or saying, can I make profit here? And so the more of those criteria that are negative, the bigger the incentive is going to have to be, right? We see this trade-off. So if you've got expensive labor, you're going to say, well, I need a massive incentive to do it. And so perhaps what happened is that Singapore decided over time they were unable to compete at a reasonable cost. And so they find a place where they can reasonably compete. So yes, it's quite possible that Thailand said, we simply are too expensive nowadays. But I think if you all rate Thailand, you probably aren't saying they're too expensive. I mean, if I added Singapore here, it would probably come up quite differently in the scoring. So I agree with you, countries sometimes just decide differently. But I mean, when you look at South Africa and the motor industry, the subsidy levels are staggering. So why do they do it? Because they go, it's still very important. It supplies a massive supply chain, and they're probably bigger than many other places who say we simply can't compete there anymore, or we have a developed market already. So yeah, I agree. I mean, this is the dynamic, right? The government's incentive, the government is bidding to have you move your expertise, your labor, your supply chain know-how into its economy. And it's making a decision. It goes, how many people will you employ? How many votes will I get? How good will you do for my economy? And so in Thailand, maybe they had lower levels of unemployment. They were quite happy, or they believed that the marginal improvement in their supply chain is going to be very small. And so they said, well, we'll offer a low price for an additional plant. And Vietnam, may have offered a very big. Now, I mean, just to give you a context, sometimes the subsidies can be 60 or 70% the value of the plant. I mean, these are big, big, big numbers. This is not trivial stuff. So depending on how much. Now, a company like Intel is solely, we just saw market entry, probably fairly solely able to do this, right? If you were if you were AMD, Vietnam probably is something that would be too big for you to take on. You say, we don't want to create a whole new supply chain. We need to go somewhere where there's already an established. So this goes back to mechanism of entry, where you've got to decide what are your skills. Okay, perfect. Another group want to go and talk about criteria, any differences in the criteria?
I'm happy to show mine, Nick.
Yep.
Yes, my screen. And Jenny and Leon, and Jenny has to drop off. I know she's got a work call, but Peggy, feel free to jump in as well. I don't know if you can see my screen now. So that was our key criteria. We looked at Dalian as our next option after Vietnam, but this was our criteria. So infrastructure, especially around access to international routes because of their airports and ports, government incentives, like the free trade zone, foreign tax benefits, labor costs, high technology, competitive education system through the partnerships with the universities that they've got, the skilled workforce that comes out of that as well, and then transportation linked to the infrastructure, and then China's entry into WTO and the industrialized area, so home to manufacturing plants already, and that was sort of how we criteriated it in terms of priority.
Okay, I'm just capturing this quickly. 1, 2 centers. Yes, I mean, maybe the incentives and the tax are similar.
Yeah.
4, 5 is high tech. What do you mean by high technology?
Leon, I think you added that one, was that right? Leon?
It's like, no. This is somebody else.
Sorry.
Peggy, do you want to add to technology?
Yeah, actually, because this is the third factory they already own 2 in China. One is in Shanghai. The other one I forgot in which phase. Sorry. So actually, they have lots of technical support for the factory if they open in Dalian. Also, because based on the competitive education system, so they actually have something similar industry technical work in this industry. So we put this one for high technology for this point.
All right, cool. Agglomeration, any other comments on agglomeration?
No.
All right, and last group.
I'll just sorry.
I've not got anything exciting to share, but I can shout just a few things out. So we had at the top investment available from government. So the ability for foreign direct investment was strong in India. We looked at regulations. So we know structures and taxes, etc. We put know-how in terms of labor and knowledge, and we looked at China and India maybe having strong innovation around engineering and how that would be useful for us. Cindy made a good point about geographical concentration. So the fact that there was already 2 plants in China, and that proximity could not be good for business risk and contingency. So moving out away from China might be beneficial in case the China market changes. Trust, we talked a lot about trust. With William mentioned this, maybe falling under kind of corruption, low corruption, anti-corruption, and regulation. We did have natural disasters on there as well, which was mentioned in the case quite a lot. And we also looked at synergy of ideas, was our last one. So like there was talked about relating to entrepreneurial spirits and energies around ideas, and we thought that could be quite an interesting one. And then in terms of the agglomeration, we looked at labor and supplier benefits was the main one in terms of networks. But for negatives, we looked at issues around getting sites. So like the more people in one space, the harder it might be to actually move in and take land and move in and build sites. And we also looked at the negative effects of saturation, and at what point does you hit a ceiling and actually it becomes a negative aspect.
What are you going to saturate? What's the what thing are you worried about?
Resources, market. Could
you
even
mean demand?
Yeah.
Demand saturation?
And potentially, I suppose, I mean, resources and whether long-term, what our impact would be in that environmental space as well. If there's lots of the same company working in the same space.
Who was your second choice?
So I think we ended up, we had to rush quite quick. We went with India in the end.
Okay.
Yeah.
And sorry, group 1, who was your second choice?
Dahlia in China.
Chennai in China or Dalian in, sorry, Chennai in India or Dalian in China?
Dalian in China for group 1.
Dalian in China, cool. Okay, cool. So I'm just going to flick this up now, if you don't mind. I'm going to share the screen. Okay, so this is kind of like what it looks like. You can see an Excel screen. Okay,
yep.
So this is, excuse the border.
Super whiz.
Okay, cool. So this is what we kind of have. Here's group 1, here's group 2, here's group 3 in terms of their rankings. You know, that's. So I wanted to talk just about, and we will keep it quick, but I wanted to try and create a framework out of this because we mentioned a lot of the key things. So one of the key items that you've got, what are the 4 criteria groups? And so you should think of it in terms of location. So location, I think many people, you know, we've discussed, that's physical things like, you know, power and roads. So these are, you know, we've got here things like transport, infrastructure, natural disaster risk. I think that is, so we've got, this is a very physical sort of attribute. The next one we can talk about is kind of strategic questions. And this is really risk and return type of ideas. And interestingly, we really not too much there. This I would suggest is strategic, although we could put strategic here by natural disaster. So, you know, group 3 mentioned, do you want to have 3 in China? And so this is part of a strategic question. Remember, Intel's got this 40% rule. So they don't want to put 40% in the same place. Now, is the same place the same country or the same city? Then they're not specific about that. And I'm not sure. But I suppose what they're trying to look at is, if we had a natural disaster, would this be a major problem for us? How risky is this decision? What are the returns like? Remember, a decision in the starts of the case of a decision is long-term. Government promises are short-term. So, you know, you might argue that corruption and trust is another strategic question in a sense. The next thing is this question of competition. And we're going to say competition or agglomeration. So these features of competition and agglomeration, you know, probably come into this. So I understand that labor is a feature of location, but as I said, we can't say location because the whole point of this is where are you physically locating a fabrication plant. So I don't want to just bury everything under location. So maybe location would be the geography.
Yeah.
You know, in other words, what are the physical attributes of it? Am I close to a port? As you've seen, you know, I mean, and I think somebody mentioned, like Dalian is close to many other suppliers, but then, you know, much of this is maybe Chennai is potentially the furthest away. So competition and agglomeration is really talking about this labor cost, but proximity to supply is the same thing. So if you went to Bangkok, proximity to supply is much better. If you go to Dalian, it's better. If you go to Chennai and Ho Chi Minh, it's lower. Hiring and labor question, competition in the market. So here's a negative point. Is there skill? Is there, I don't know if security we might put under strategic. Synergies we can put under competition. And then the final one is this area of government incentives. So here's like a neat framework. We've got 4 things that we can kind of categorize. Physically, what does the place look like? How much money are people paying me to go there? What's my competitive environment going to look like? And so sometimes this is good, sometimes it's bad. Yes, these agglomeration benefits, shared infrastructure, production site quality, labor skills are all pros. but you get cons like, I can't, you know, I mean, there's no more to sell. I can't find physical location. Another key benefit I just want to point out, and this is a softer one, but a key benefit, is actually dealing with government. And I'm putting that under the benefits. So if you have 4 semiconductor fabrication plants, does the government shut down semiconductor fabrication? No way, no way. Too much money, too many people unemployed, too many problems. If you are the Lone Ranger, you could be nationalized. So if you're very concerned about this, you actually negotiate better with government as a more stable industry. You know, so it's quite important that a key benefit that wasn't mentioned is this idea that if you are a substantial industry, you can actually negotiate better with governments, which means your deals are more stable. So if government has promised you something and there's 4 of you and they start reneging on promises, the pushback is much bigger than if there's 1 of you and you just need to accept it and move on. So I think that's a key agglomeration benefit. So the government incentives we mentioned quite well here. Taxes and regulation, and you know, what will they waive for you, etc. This is maybe strategic. All right, so I think that using these 4 kind of headings is probably a helpful way of arranging your thoughts. To go, okay, cool. What are the things that we need to classify here? When we talk about government incentives, we had a bit of a discussion about why did different countries offer different amounts, and we said, you know, as Leona had brought up, well, sometimes they have different benefits they get out of this deal. So if you are very new, you will pay a lot more to get an Intel into your country because they're going to set up a supply chain that nobody else will. Whereas if you're fairly advanced, you might offer a lot less. Now we see quite aggressive competition worldwide. It's much more in vogue. It's a kind of non-tariff competition. And in fact, in the United States, you now see it between cities. So a company like Amazon, you know, asks cities to bid for its head office to move there. So this is a kind of natural phenomenon, but it's very interesting. If you look at Amazon's new headquarters, you can have a look at the bids that Amazon got from cities for it to move its headquarters to them. Same process, different concept there. It's simply moving its head office, but cities argue that it's going to bring thousands and thousands of jobs and so on. So we've spoken about 4 things that you can use to kind of arrange your ideas. We've spoken about agglomeration benefits and costs, governments. Maybe the thing we didn't talk about is what governments need to get out of it. And so some incentives like free power are actually fairly difficult for governments to give, because if that goes onto the newspaper, there's a lot of discussion about, is that fair? Other benefits like free training of workforce are obviously much easier for governments to give. So when you need to negotiate, really you need to think about, what does a government need out of me, aside from my factory? But if you're going to establish a plant and your big request to a government is you need to support me with training, it's a reasonably easy giveaway for a government, because as you saw in the Intel case B, the government wanted a lot of publicity around certain events. And the reason they want that is, in the end, governments are vote collecting sort of entities, you know, and they kind of they judge that the economy is a good way to collect more votes. And maybe if you put it as coldly as that. So good. That is Intel. You see where they went. You can see where you may have gone for good and bad reasons. And thank you very much. I will see you all on Thursday.
I'm just gonna. Oh, sorry.
Oh, Paul first.
Go on,
sorry?
Peggy.
No, I'm not asking about this. You first.
Oh, I was just going to say, I was just chatting, and there's some similarities in terms of what we've been discussing, obviously, that we'll talk to you on Thursday around the CAGE framework.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So CAGE is largely focused on bilateral differences. So absolutely, this is the kind of warm-up as we try to do, so that each lecture kind of is linked with the rest. It's not completely separate. But yeah, so bilateral differences are, you know, we could introduce bilateral differences into this. I would suggest that all of these are quite different to Intel's home country. So the culture difference here is going to be high everywhere, right? Culture, administrative, geographically, economically, high. So that's why that didn't really come into this case, because on those dimensions, these were all very different. But in terms of zooming in and out, Intel's going, okay, they're all very different, but we see a key arbitrage difference. So from an adding framework perspective, this is about, there's some real cost reductions here through arbitrage. That's why they're coming here. Otherwise, they should set up another fab plant at home and move on. But you would argue that learning is quite difficult here. So really, this adding framework is probably talking mainly about the cost reduction. And you can see that one of the strategic things that Intel is doing is limiting the 40% per country. It might suit them to stick all of their chips in one massive plant, but the risk-return trade-off is poor. So remember, in adding framework, one of the first things we said is you need to understand where you are on your cost curve. And if you put all of your chips in one plant, will you halve their cost? Because you're certainly going to double your risk. And so Intel has picked a number, 40%. And that probably means that this size plant is sort of at 90% the efficiency of an even bigger plant. And for the extra 10%, you wouldn't concentrate all your risk. Interesting, this was 2006. Obviously, there was a very substantial tsunami, and flood, which happened, a couple of years after that. So, not a bad call from Intel.
Nicholas, can I ask a question? I think today there's a lot of discussion, but as I look at this discussion, how relevant are this to our assignment? Can I relate back to the assignment? I don't see the relevance. Maybe I'm missing something.
Yeah. No, your course isn't about your assignments, right? So this is an international business course. And so this is very relevant for your job, I would suggest, for your takeout. How do you decide between plants? This framework could be extended to a services business, right? Where would you locate a new services business? But no, Intel is much more about this idea of where do we establish plants. And I think that's a fundamentally important part of international business. The assignment itself, you're not really locating a plant. Adding framework is probably more relevant to the assignment. Politico economic setup is not relevant, particularly to your assignment. So I would say the assignment is really the adding framework and maybe the emerging markets part. But fairly, this is a lot of value outside of the assignment. So that's why it's here.
Nick, about the assessment 3, I want to ask, we need to create the company, or we can use a current company as an example to do the assessment 3?
Assessment 3, no, it's another case study.
Also, assessment 3 also with regards for case study.
Absolutely.
When we get the case study then.
Yeah, when you get the case study, sure. But yeah, so look, there's some extra time for assessment 3. It is a case study. I think that, again, it fits neatly into many of these frameworks that we're providing. So it's not, I'm quite confident that as these skills are being practiced in these cases, it's really not going to be a whole new revelation of things. And obviously other points are going to be more or less valid. But as I said, it's not possible to pick every case to highlight every piece of every course. And that would become quite challenging. So it's probably better that we take cases that focus on specific skills. You park it, you know the skill. One day, if somebody says, May, I need to set up a plant, please rank these countries, you go, yep, cool, got it. I know how to do this. Whether or not we find time to assess on it, this is a super intense course, so there's limits to what we can assess. Cool.
Can we have last request to give us the assignment 3 earlier as possible? Thank you. Given that it's April 25th, I think we are really all pressing for a 3005 essay, right? Everybody will agree. So if you can give us earlier, that would be really helpful. Really helpful.
No problem, no problem. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
See you later.
Nicholas, cheers.
Bye.
Thank you.